Definitely, but I mean that's just I would say that the distinction there is I think it's not so much a cultural shift as it is a shift in an elite culture that commands a large amount of power, and that again it's fascinating to me, having actually just moved out here from Michigan, to see that in the state of Virginia a pack of cigarettes costs $3.90, $4 maybe at most, versus say $6.50 in Michigan, and versus $8 in the District of Columbia, where I'm actually a resident. Versus $12 in New York City, exactly. I don't think that it's so much that it's a cultural shift, because if you look at the rates of tobacco consumption, they haven't actually changed all that much, especially in those Cro-Magnon red states. I don't think that there's been a cultural shift. I just think that power has been concentrated in the hands of people who, for bizarre reasons that I can't understand, really hate the idea of someone enjoying a cigarette.
I think this is the first time we've agreed all night that, that syntaxes suck. Although I would be so bold as to say that, 750,000 arrests were made last year for marijuana in the United States. Well, in 2011, which is the most recent year for which data is available. And I think that some syntaxes are a fair exchange for not ruining the lives of young people and old people. Because Rand Paul loves to talk about the young people. He seldom talks about what happens to old drug users. Like my mom. Just kidding, Mom. Love you. I think maybe some syntaxes on pot are a fair exchange for, avoiding having a mugshot come up every time you apply for a job, for avoiding having a felony record or a misdemeanor record, or for owing a $200 fine that you can afford to pay that then doubles in 30 days and then turns into a mandatory court appearance and then turns into 30 days in jail, which ends up with you being unemployed. So, I have mixed feelings about syntaxes. Agree they're much too high for cigarettes.
So I have a good follow-on question that from Mike. But I like Matt's point about how the rule of law is kind of tarnished if you don't prosecute violators of whatever code. And so even with the cultural shifts and the acceptance and all of that, what do you think that the liberalization of drug use has meant for just kind of the rule of law in general, and the respect for which we have for the criminal justice system? When you talk about liberalization, you're talking about concerted efforts by advocates to change the law. Then I think that sort of demonstrates maybe not a respect for the law so much as a total agreement that you've got to change the law, that this can't all be about jury nullification and peaceful resistance, right? It's got to be more than that. Matt's point, locking up all the drug users, I don't know if we all know what that means. 18.1 million people abused marijuana in the last 30 days, according to the National Institute of Drug Abuse. 750,000 arrests were made, even if you allow for all 750,000 or so of those arrests being individual people, different people, as opposed to, a fifth of those arrests being one person arrested several times or something. You're talking about increasing the amount of police assigned to marijuana just by an amazing amount of money. And this is already with us incarcerating 25% of the world's prisoners. That disparity between the number of users and the number of arrests is the same for harder drugs. Cocaine and heroin, there were 250,000 arrests for all cocaine and heroin crimes. Trafficking, dealing, possession, possession with intent to distribute, all of that. There were 250,000 in 2011. And there were over 2 million people that the National Institute for Drug Abuse estimates had used either heroin or cocaine, or a derivative of the two, with the exception of prescription pills, which is its own category, had used those in the last 30 days. So, right there, there's 20 million offenders. About 1 million of them are being locked up. We have roughly 1 million law enforcement agents in the United States. More specifically, we have 45 DEA agents in Colorado and 45 in Washington State. You cannot arrest your way out of this problem, and that saying, which the drug czar's office loves to say because they think that you need to treat people instead of incarcerate them. It's true in that sense, in that if you lock up an addict, you don't improve their life and you don't improve anybody else's. It's also true in the sense that it is literally impossible to arrest your way out of this problem. You cannot do it. It will never happen. And that's, You want to bring in prescription pill violators. You want to bring in people who are using stuff like meth. You know, your numbers go high. I wouldn't say that they go. I mean, you know, it sort of cascades down, right? So the number of prescription pill users and that stuff is all much lower than marijuana. But you could say, you know, a conservative estimate would be that there are 20 to 23 million people who are using drugs without consequence every year in the United States. So.
Could I just follow up real quick?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I think that the point is not to lock up every person who would hypothetically use cannabis or some other drug. That's the whole point of taking it seriously by interdicting demand, which means, you know, when someone does come forth in possession and is convicted and is sent to prison, that discourages people from doing it. So all these millions and millions, maybe it takes spending a little bit more money on policing and incarceration in the short term, but eventually, I don't think it's going to take that long. I mean, how many people in this room who, if they were told, you take this risk, you're caught, you're going to prison for 5 years, who would do it? That's crazy.
Follow-up question. Who would fight back?
Hell yes.
Who would fight back? Tomorrow, everything is illegal. Who fights back? This is it? You call yourself libertarians. I don't know. Is that a third of the room?
So you're all going to go to prison? I mean, it's nice to say
We
that.
won't go to prison. We'll go to Carla.
Open government revolt over pot.
Basically.
All right, we are going to do, I think, one more. We're going to do two more. We're going to do two more questions, and I would remind you that these folks are sticking around. We're going to have at least 45 minutes of drinking to go. So if you have empty beer cans, those are fine to throw. Full beer cans, we have a prohibition on that in this office. So we're going to go over to the left, and then we'll see from there.
I have a question for Matt. Your comments suggest to me that you consider yourself, I would guess, a traditionalist, Russell Kirk and Burke, in that line of thought. But I think, if I'm right, wouldn't it be the case though that a true Burkean or a true Kirkian, as Buckley did on this issue, recognizes that society changes, evolves, and that yes, marijuana was once condemned by society, but that's changing. There needs to be legal changes. And B, there are mediating, the reason that we as classical liberals and traditional conservatives, one of the things that we're united on, as per Frank Meyer, the fusionist school of thought, is that the mediating institutions, schools, churches, families, do a better job of inoculating people from abuse of drugs than a cop kicking down your door will ever do. So I would say that your argument is actually unconservative, and Mike is actually the traditionalist.
Well, that's not a question. No, what's the question?
Well, the question is.
So I'll say right away. I hope it's not too flippant, but I mean, Burke was a Whig, Kirk was a fraud and a Philistine, and Buckley was a poseur. So yeah, I don't know, QED. I mean, my conservatism is the conservatism of Hobbes and Dr. Johnson. So, but not to be flippant, actually, I definitely understand where you're coming from. I understand what you mean in terms of the cultural shift, but I would say that we need to be careful, recognize that in a mass democracy with mass communication, that public opinion can shift very rapidly in one direction and shift very rapidly back in another direction, and that one should be very careful not to think that under the influence of a culture. I mean, I just wrote a piece about Girls, the best show on television. And you look at Girls and you think, you know, a culture where girls could be a critical darling is definitely one in which marijuana use, amongst a whole host of other things, is really not, you know, any kind of a problem. But I don't know. I don't know what that means long term.